We're continuing with Chapter 2, and this is the third of 3 parts. We are also continuing our discussion of transnational crime generally and terrorism more specifically. One of the problems, as mentioned in the previous lecture, was that people don't agree on what the definition of terrorism might be. It involves very different aspects, and different key points are emphasized depending upon what the goal of the definition might be. Because of that lack of agreement on definitions of terrorism, or a definition of terrorism, there are some who believe it's better to study terrorism through things like typologies instead of trying to get an agreed upon definition. And when we do that, we can look at terrorism from a variety of different points of view. The following slides will take a look at just a couple of those types of ways that typologies can be helpful. For example, when terrorism is classified by place, people can identify at least 4, and usually quite more, versions of terrorism. Domestic terrorism, for example, is that terrorism that is committed within a particular country by residents of that country. International terrorism, on the other hand, is representatives from a country against another country. And it's probably this version of terrorism that the average person in the United States would think about. Although we know that, well, domestic terrorism exists, we have Timothy McVeigh in the United States as an example. I think when the term itself, terrorism, is mentioned, what comes to mind to most individuals are, in the United States, for example, actions by Al-Qaeda from another country representing acts on September 11th. Those kind of things are more likely to stick in one's mind, but that's only one type, international terrorism, only one type of terrorism when we're looking at terrorism by place. State-sponsored terrorism would be examples of governments directly supporting a terrorist act or organizations through funds that they provide, weapons, training camps, etc. An example of this, of course, would be in Afghanistan, when the United States believes that the Taliban was supporting Al-Qaeda networks, and as a result of the attacks on September 11th, the United States acted against the Taliban in Afghanistan, believing them to have been providing state-sponsored terrorism. International terrorism also occurs within place. It's referring to conflict that takes place within a country or within a group by opposing sides, so that there's destruction that occurs and affects both sides. As we're preparing this in the Ukraine, for example, there are some people who believe that the conflict within the Ukraine is internecine in the sense that there are 2 groups within a particular country that are behaving in a manner that is mutually destructive to both sides. Unfortunately, we can find many examples of this around the world, of where the conflicting groups end up causing problems within a country and within the group itself. So that's one way in which terrorism can be classified as a typology by place. Other people prefer to look at terrorism by issue, and saying that this is the better way to understand terrorism. And some of those issues that have been raised are religion, nationalism, cause-based, or environmental. We'll spend a little bit more time on religion and nationalist, but let me briefly mention those. Under religion, violence is used to further what are believed to be divinely commanded purposes, and again, Al-Qaeda is an example here. Under nationalist terrorism, the goal is to promote the interests of minority groups who are believed to be persecuted under the majority rule. The IRA, the PLO, the Irish Republican Army, the Palestinian Liberation Organization are examples of nationalist terrorists. Cause-based, here the issue is a particular social or religious cause. The Islamic Holy War, abortion clinic bombings are causes or issues that can be raised and looked at by terrorist groups. And environmental terrorism, dedicated to slowing down the development. The Animal Liberation Front or Earth First are examples that are often used of issue-based terrorism, more specifically environmental issues in this case. But let's take a little bit closer look at nationalist terrorism. This is a very controversial one, since those being called terrorists often see themselves as being freedom fighters. The quote from Yasser Arafat that was provided by him back in 1974 when speaking to the United Nations really sums up this idea of whether somebody is, or a question of whether somebody is a freedom fighter or a terrorist, rather nicely. And as you can see, the quote, "The difference between the revolutionary," Arafat said, "and the terrorist lies in the reason for which each fights. For whoever stands by a just cause and fights for the freedom and liberation of his land from the invaders, the settlers, the colonists, cannot possibly be called a terrorist." And of course, there are those who argue that the United States, for example, was founded as a result of nationalist terrorism. The freedom fighters during the War for Independence were seen, could be seen, I don't think the term was used, but the British would certainly have seen them as being what we might call today terrorists, whereas the independence fighters themselves, the colonists, saw themselves as being freedom fighters. So it's a very difficult term to grasp, and one of the reasons why it's difficult, for example, to get the United Nations to agree on a definition of terrorism, since, or even identifying particular groups as being terrorist groups, because of this difficulty of whether somebody is a freedom fighter or a terrorist. Religious terrorism, this has been going on, or the term religious terrorism is referred to for quite a number of decades and centuries even. Religion-inspired terrorism was declining in the 19th and 20th century and replaced by politically inspired terrorism. But many people believe that in more recent times, religious terrorism seems to be making a comeback. And here, terrorism is being used to further what the group sees as being divinely commanded purposes. That is, they are being directed by God or Allah to carry out divine commands from God or from Allah. Typically, these have a spiritual rather than military objective. That makes it very difficult to respond to, and even more so, religion is not bounded by any national borders, and so religious terrorists have a much broader geographic base than do nationalist terrorists, for example. And because of these 2 points, the idea that there are spiritual rather than military objectives, and there is a lack of boundaries in which the terrorists confine their behavior, makes religious terrorism extremely difficult to fight and to even identify as to where the fight should take place. There isn't, again, a geographical area that can be related to, nor can you even anticipate what the military objective might be. So again, religious terrorism is seen as being particularly difficult, and many believe is becoming a more widespread form of terrorism today. The example of Al-Qaeda, again, is mentioned here, a multinational force with, or force of people, not a military force, with members from numerous countries and a worldwide presence, again, making it very, very difficult to respond to. But responses are attempted, and responses to transnational crime in general is what the chapter concludes on. And not just talking about terrorism specifically, but here we can make reference to national efforts, regional efforts, and supranational efforts to combat or respond to transnational crime. The national efforts, in most any country, you can find government agencies who are working to combat crimes at the domestic level, both domestic crime and transnational crime being responded to at the domestic level. This probably involves cooperative efforts with other country governments, but we would still make reference to them as being national efforts. Regional efforts, we have several examples. Southeast Asian nations, ASEAN is the acronym, and Europol and Eurojust are all groups that we've talked about already and we'll have occasion to talk about again, that are groups of individuals, organizations that are set up in a regional effort to combat transnational crime within a particular region. And the supranational or international efforts, primary examples being groups like United Nations, Interpol, the International Organization for Migration, are all examples. We'll see more of these, I'm sure, when we look at the discussion boards that we have on the individual types of transnational crimes to give us an idea. This concludes Chapter 2 and Part 3 of Chapter 2 more specifically, and hopefully it's given you a bit of an overview of comparative criminology broadly and how comparative criminologists would look at transnational crime more specifically. And again, a reminder that the remainder of the book concentrates more on issues of comparative criminal justice. And that's why we didn't really say much more about it in this chapter than distinguishing it at the beginning from comparative criminology. Thank you for your attention.